joined this evening with these two. They can come and say hello. But whilst I have a chat with you, I'm going to put them back. You're probably seeing them playing in the background. I thought, as we're in lockdown, it might be something to entertain you, that I'd read you a story. And a story that I've chosen is The Explorer by Katherine Rundell. But before I read it, I'm going to put on my glasses. Chapter 1. Flight. Like a man-made magic wish, the aeroplane began to rise. The boy sitting in the cockpit grabbed his seat and held his breath as the plane climbed into the arms of the sky. Fred's jaw was set with concentration and his fingers twitched, following the movements of the pilot beside him. Joystick, throttle. The aeroplane vibrated as it flew faster into the setting sun, following the swerve of the Amazon River below. Fred could see the reflection of the six-seater plane, a spot of black on the vast sweep of blue as it sped towards Manus, the city on the water. He brushed his hair out of his eyes and pressed his forehead against the window. Behind Fred sat a girl and her little brother. They had the same slanted eyebrows and the same brown skin, the same long eyelashes. The girl had been shy, hugging her parents until the last possible moment at the airfield. Now she was staring down at the water, singing under her breath, her brother trying to eat his seatbelt. In the next row, on her own, sat a pale girl with blonde hair down to her waist. Her blouse had a neck ruffle that came up to her chin, and she kept tugging it down and grimacing. She was determinedly not looking out of the window. The airfield they had just left had been dusty and almost deserted, just a strip of tarmac under the ferocious Brazilian sun. Fred's cousin had insisted that he wear his school uniform and cricket jumper, and now, inside the hot, airless cabin, he felt like he was being gently cooked in his own skin. The engine gave a whine and the pilot frowned and tapped the joystick. He was old and sultry, with brisk nostril hair and a grey waxed moustache which seemed to reject the usual laws of gravity. He touched the throttle and the plane soared upwards, higher into the clouds. It was almost dark when Fred began to worry. The pilot began to belch, first quietly, then violently, and then repeatedly. His hand jerked and the plane dipped suddenly to the left. Someone screamed behind Fred. The plane lurched away from the river and over the canopy. The pilot grunted, gasped and wound back the throttle, slowing the engine. He gave a cough that sounded like a choke. Fred stared at the man. He was turning the same shade of grey as his moustache. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. "Is there something I can do?" Fighting for breath, the pilot shook his head. He reached over to the control panel and cut the engine. The roar ceased. The noise of the plane dipped downwards, and the trees rose up. "What's happening?" asked the blonde girl sharply. "What's he doing? Make him stop." The little boy in the back began to shriek. The pilot gasped. Fred's wrist hard for a single moment. Then his head slumped against the dashboard, and the sky, which a seconds before seemed so reliable, gave way. Next chapter. The Green Dark. Fred wondered as he ran if he was dead. but he thought death would surely be quieter. The roar of the flames and his own blood vibrated through his hands and feet. The night was black. He tried to heave in breath to shout for help as he ran, but his throat was too dry and ashy to yell. He jabbed his finger into the back of his tongue to summon up some spit. "Is anybody there? Help! Fire!" he shouted. The fire called back in response. A tree behind him sent up a fountain of flames. There was a rumble of thunder, but nothing else replied. A burning branch cracked. It spat red and fell in a cascade of sparks. Fred leapt sideways, stumbling backwards into the dark and smacking his head against something hard. The branch landed exactly where he'd been standing seconds before. He swallowed the bile that had risen in his throat and began to run again, faster and wilder. Something landed on his chin and he ducked, smacking at his face, but it was only a raindrop. The rain was suddenly there and hard. It turned to soot and sweat on his hands, to something like tar, but it began to quench the fire. Fred slowed his run to a jog and then stopped, gasping, choking. He looked back the way he'd come. The little aeroplane was in the trees. It was smoking, sending up clouds of white and grey into the night sky. He stared around, dizzy and desperate, but he couldn't see or hear a single human, only the fern-like plants growing around his ankles, and the trees reaching hundreds of feet. Hey! Hey! The trees reaching hundreds of feet into the sky. And then he panicked, dived, and a shriek of birds went up. He shook his head hard, trying to banish the shipwreck roar in his ears. The hair on his arms was singing. I apologise. The hair on his arms was singed and smelt of eggs. He put his hands to his forehead. His eyebrows had charred and part of it came away on his fingers. He wiped his eyebrow on the sleeve of his shirt. Fred looked down at himself. One leg of his trousers was ripped all the way up to the pocket, but none of his bones felt broken. There was a vicious pain, though, in the back and his neck, and it made his arms and legs feel like they were far off and foreign. A voice came suddenly from the dark. "Who's there? Get away from us!" Fred spun round, his ears still buzzing. He grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it in the direction of the voice. He ducked behind a tree and crouched on his haunches, posed to jump or run. His heart sounded like a one-man band. He tried not to exhale. The voice said, "For God's sake, don't throw things." It was a girl's voice. Fred looked out from behind the tree. The light of the moon filtered deep green to the forest floor, casting long-fingered shadows against the trees, and he could see only two bushes, and both of them were rustling. "Who is it? Who's there?" The voice came from the second bush. Fred squinted through the dark, feeling the remaining hair rise up on his arms. "Please don't hurt us," said the bush. The accent wasn't British. It was something softer, and the voice was definitely a child's, but not an adult's. "Was it you throwing poo?" Fred looked down at the ground. He'd snatched up a piece of years-old, fossilised animal dung. "Oh," he said, "yes." He was becoming accustomed to the dark and see the shine of the eyes peering out from the grey-green gloom of the undergrowth. "Are you from that plane? Are you hurt?" "Yes, we're hurt. We fell out of the sky," said one bush, as the other said, "No, not badly." "You came out," said Fred. "It's only me here." The second bush parted. Fred's heart gave a great leap. Both the girl and her brother were covered in scratches and burns and ash, which had mixed with sweat and rain and made a kind of paste on their faces. But they were alive, and he was not alone. "You survived," he said. "Well, obviously we did," said the first bush. "Or we'd be both less talkative, wouldn't we?" The blonde girl stepped out into the lashing rain. She stared from Fred to the other two, unsmiling. "I'm Con," she said. "It's short for Constantinia." But if you call me that, I'll kill you. Fred glanced at the other girl. She smiled nervously and shrugged. Right, he said. If you say so, I'm Fred. I'm Leela, said the second girl. She held her brother on her hip. And this is Max. Hi. Fred tried to smile, but it made the cuts on his cheeks stretch and burn, so he stopped and made do with a grin that involved only the left half of his face. Max was breathless and at a stage of crying, and he clung to his sister so tightly his fingers were pressed bruises on her skin. She was leaning over to one side to hold him up, shaking with the effort. They looked, Fred thought, like two-headed creatures, arms entwined. Is your brother badly hurt? He asked. Leela patted her brother desperately on the back. He won't talk, he's just crying. Con looked back towards the fire and shivered. The flames cast a light on her face. She was no longer blonde. Her hair was grey with soot and brown with blood, and she had a scratch on her shoulder that looked deep. Are you all right? He asked, wiping rain out of his eyes. That cut looks bad. No, I'm not all right, Con spat. We're lost in the Amazon jungle, and statistically speaking, it's very likely that we're going to die. I know, Fred didn't feel he needed reminding. I meant, well... So no, Con's voice grew thin and high. I think it would be safe to say that none of us are all right. Not at all, not even slightly. The bushes rustled. The rain hammered down on Fred's face. We need to find shelter, he said. A big tree or a cave or something that would... No, Max gave a sudden scream, a yell that was wet with spit and fear. Fred stepped backwards, raising his hands. Don't cry, I just thought... And then his eyes followed Max's finger. There, 3 inches from Freddy's shoe, was a snake. It was speckled brown and black, patchwork to match the jungle floor, and its head was as big as a fist. For 1 second nobody breathed. The jungle waited, and then Max let out a second scream that dug deep into the night as the 4 of them turned and fled. The ground was sodden, and they ran, pell-mell, sending up mud into one another's eyes and grazing their elbows against trees. Fred ran as if his body was not his own, faster than he'd ever run. His palms stretched ahead of him. He tripped over a root and turned a full somersault, coming up spitting earth. He ran on. The rain blinded him and shadows flashed past him in the darkness. There was a yell behind him. Please, Max, said Leela. Fred turned back, skidding in the mud. He won't run. Leela bent over her brother. And I can't carry him. The little boy lay on his back, weeping up at the sky, his whole body shaking in the driving rain. Come on, Fred heaved, Max up over his shoulder. The boy was far heavier than he'd expected, and he screamed as Fred lifted him. But Fred grabbed both of Max's knees and started running. His whole body screamed with pain. He could hear Leela, her feet thumping close behind them. The stitch in Fred's side was almost unbearable when he tore out of the trees and into a sudden clearing. He halted, and Max bumped his head against Fred's spine and yelled. Angrily, he began to bite one of Fred's shoulders. Please don't, said Fred, but he was barely paying any attention to the boy on his back. He stared, stunned, ahead of him. They were standing at the edge of a wide circle of trees, open to the sky and lit by the fat moon. There was a carpet of green moss and grass, and the stars above them were clustered so thickly that the silver outnumbered the night. Fred lowered Max to the ground and stood bent over, his hands on his thighs, panting. Did the snake chase us? Said Max. No, gasped Con. How do you know? Wailed Max. Leela dropped to her knees, clutching at her side. Snakes don't, Maxie. We both know that. I panicked, said Con. Her voice was bitter. That's what happened. See? Look, no snakes. We were not stupid. We're now even more lost. The ground in the clearing sloped slightly towards a large puddle of water. Fred crossed over to it, his muscles aching, and then he sniffed. It smelt of rotten things. He was feverishly thirsty. He took a tiny sip and immediately spat it out. "It's no good," he said. "It tastes like a dead person's feet." "But I'm thirsty," said Max. Fred looked around the clearing, hoping to find water before Max started crying again. "If you wring out your hair," he said, "there'll be water in that." He tugged his dark fringe down over his forehead and twisted it. A few drops fell onto his tongue. "It's better than nothing." Max chewed on his hair for a second and then scrunched his eyes closed. "I'm scared," he said. It was said without whining, a simple matter of fact. Somehow it was worse than the tears, Fred thought. "I know," Leela said softly. "We all are, Maxie." She crossed to her brother and pulled him close to her. His small bony fingers closed over a burn on her wrist. But she didn't brush him away. She began to whisper in his ear, in Portuguese, something soft, almost a song, a lullaby. They were both shaking slightly. Fred swallowed. "All this will look less bad in the morning," he said. "Will it?" said Con. There was a bite to her question. "Will it? Will it really?" "It can't look much worse," he said. "Once it's light, we'll be able to work out a way to get home." Con looked at him. There was a challenge in the air, and Fred stared unblinkingly back at her. Her face was all geometry, sharp chin, sharp cheekbones, sharp eyes. "What now then?" she said. "And Mama and Papa say," began Leela. The mention of her parents made her face crease and crumple, but she swallowed and went on. "They always say you need to sleep before you think. They say when you're exhausted, you do stupid things. And they are scientists, so we should sleep." Fred found his whole body was aching. "Good, fine, let's sleep." He lay down on his side in the wet grass. His clothes were soaked through, but the air was warm. He closed his eyes. Perhaps he would wake up in his bed at school, he thought, next to the snoring of his roommates, Jones and Scrassy. An ant crawled over his cheek. "But aren't we supposed to stay awake in case we die of concussion?" said Con. "I think if we get concussion, we'd be dizzy," said Leela. Fred, already half asleep, tried to work out if he was dizzy. The world began to spin away from him. "If we all die in the night, I'm blaming both of you," said Con. It was on that cheery thought that Fred felt himself dropping down away from the jungle and the thick night air into sleep. Next chapter is called The Den. I'm going to do that in another recording. The Explorer.